Hi, everyone. Welcome to Stand With Us Connect. Are we on? Hi, everyone. Welcome to Stand With Us Connect. I'm Roz Rothstein, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Stand With Us, a 19-year-old organization that is actually working on 5 continents, supporting Israel, inspiring people about Israel, and fighting anti-Semitism. Welcome. These are very difficult times. We understand that, and we are so happy to have you with us. I'm broadcasting live from Los Angeles, and Einat Wilf is in Tel Aviv. So we're so happy to have her with us today. Before we introduce her, I'd like to just say a little bit about Stand With Us Connect. This is our new platform since the pandemic, and we're able to bring Israel right to your homes. And not only that, but we can actually tailor-make programs for you, for your churches, your synagogues. And so we are very excited about that. If you have an idea about something you need, come to us. We'll work with you. It's our pleasure. It's what we want to be doing. So, and also if you like our work, don't forget to support us, standwithus.com/donate. Don't forget to support our work. Before I introduce Einat Wilf, Dr. Einat Wilf, I just want to say thank you to Einat, because not only just about today, but because you have been with us already for years, inspiring hundreds, if not thousands of students from all over the world. I don't know if you realize, Einat, but every time you joined us for our international conferences in Los Angeles, that drew students from the UK, from all over Canada, from Brazil, from all over the United States. So you literally are addressing, and from Germany, you were literally addressing students, a global audience of not just any students, but student leaders on high schools and college campuses. And they love you. They love you. So thank you so much for that. So to introduce Einat Wilf, our guest for today's Stand With Us Connect. She has just completed a book, The War of Return, how Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has obstructed the path to peace. Wilf is a former member of the Israeli parliament, where she served from 2010 to 2013, serving as chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. She is also a prominent commentator on matters of foreign policy, economics, education, Israel, and Zionism. Excuse me one second. Sorry. Dr. Wilf has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. Born and raised in Israel, Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the IDF. Welcome, Dr. Einat Wilf. So
Thank you.
Let's start from the very beginning. You wrote this wonderful book, and we're very interested in an overview and what motivated you to write the book.
So thank you truly for having me here and for the global audience that you bring together to this issue. So by now I've spent a decade of my life, one way or another, working on writing, speaking about the Palestinian refugee issue and Unruh, the UN agency that sustains it. And I want to discuss a bit why I thought this was a topic worthy devoting a decade to this issue, to write a book about it, to speak about it. And it really came out of my experiences in growing up in Israel and being very much a devoted person of the Israeli peace camp. I grew up into the Labor Party. I had worked with Yossi Beilin, the architect of the Oslo Accords, with Shimon Peres. I was a member of parliament on behalf of the Labor Party, but really as a young adult, I very much was part of the Labor Party politics and believed in its platform, which during that time of the 80s and 90s was associated with a very simple, almost elegant formula in its simplicity. And it basically said this: for Israel to have peace, the path is very simple. All that Israel has to do is hand over land, which Israel acquired as a result of the Six-Day War, And in return for this land, it will receive peace, the peace that eluded it when it was born. And for a while, this was a beautiful formula that many people believed is working. Peace with Egypt was based on this formula. Israel handed over the Sinai Peninsula, twice the size of Israel, and signed a peace agreement with Egypt. We can have an interesting discussion 40 years later whether what we have with Egypt is peace, but at the time it seemed to be working. Land for peace. Now, the 1990s were really the decade of land for peace. It was a decade globally of euphoria. The Soviet Union collapsed, Eastern Europe became free, apartheid in South Africa came to an end, Northern Ireland signed a peace agreement, and this global feeling of the end of history captured us as well. And the feeling was that we are going to make peace, and the path was land for peace. We negotiated with Syria over the Golan Heights. We signed a peace agreement with Jordan when Jordan gave up its territorial claim to the West Bank. And of course, the highlight was the Oslo Accords, where we negotiated directly with the PLO over the future of the West Bank and Gaza. And the 90s, this euphoria of the 90s culminates in 2000. Ehud Barak, the head of the peace camp in Israel, Labor Party leader, goes to Camp David, which of course is very symbolic. This is where peace was negotiated with Egypt. And he puts on the table a bold proposal. Some people now say reckless, but people forget how bold it was at the time. Everything that we were told that the Palestinians wanted: a fully sovereign, independent Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza. No settlements. The settlements were not going to be an issue. They were either going to be dismantled or exchanged for equivalent land. No occupation. It was going to be a fully sovereign state. And even East Jerusalem was going to be its capital, including parts in the old city, holy sites. So check all the boxes for what the Palestinians, we were told they wanted. All they had to do was say yes. What do? They walk away. Arafat walks away. Abu Mazen walks away 8 years later from a similar proposal by Ehud Olmert. And not only do they walk away from that, it's followed by bloody violence in our streets. And a lot of Israelis with my background from the peace camp begin to ask a very obvious question. What do the Palestinians want? And to the occupation, and they didn't take it. So what do they want? And what at this point, basically, Adi comes from a similar background. He was a senior editor and journalist with Haaretz. We meet with Palestinians. We begin to research the topic, and we realize, amazingly, that it was hiding in plain sight. The Palestinians told us all along what they wanted. We either didn't listen, or when we listened, we just didn't take it seriously. They told us what they wanted: Palestine from the river to the sea. They wanted something that they called a right of return, which in the book we explain is neither a right nor by now is it a return. But what it means to Palestinians is, in their view, it means that millions of Palestinians, the lowest number is 5.5 million, which Unruh registers. The higher number is 8-9 million, which the Palestinian leadership claims. But either way, they believe that millions of Palestinians possess an internationally sanctioned right to settle in breach of Israeli sovereignty within the state of Israel in its pre-1967 territory. And of course, the numbers are such that realizing this would mean that the state of Israel becomes an Arab-Palestinian state with a Jewish minority. And in the book, we detail the story of the Palestinian right of return, of the refugee issue. We answer the question of how is it that, unlike all other refugees in the world from that time, they still consider themselves refugees. And we especially highlight the Western Indulgence that has allowed this issue to be created and sustained for over 7 decades. and what needs to be done in order to actually chart a course for true peace.
Thank you. So important. Can you elaborate a little bit about Unruh?
Yes. So Unruh is still amazingly a temporary agency, which was established 70 years ago in order to settle and help settle and integrate the Arab refugees from the War of 1948. During the war, as with any war, and we detail in the book the many wars throughout the 20th century, certainly in those decades, refugees are created in the course of war. In all other wars, they were settled in place or resettled elsewhere. They did not return to the original territory, those, whether India or Pakistan or South Korea or India or Ukraine or Germany, they moved on. The Palestinian refugees themselves refused to move on. It has to do, of course, with their view that the outcome of the War of 1948 in the form of the establishment of a sovereign state of Israel is unacceptable. And as far as they're concerned, the War of 1948, they might have lost the battle, but they don't view it as an end of topic, an end of war. They want to keep the file open. They refuse settlement. So Unruh, unlike other temporary agencies, we tell the story, for example, of Unruh, which settled in a few short years Korean refugees from the Korean War in about the same time, with less money than was allocated for Unruh at the time. And look at where South Korea is today. Refugees did not return, they did not demand return. And look at the country that South Korea is. It could have been the Palestinians. But no, they wanted to keep the war open. They refused resettlement. And as a result, Unruh was unable to achieve its goal as a temporary agency of settling and integrating the refugees in the Arab states to which they fled. And let us remember, they were Arabs. They spoke the same language, the same ethnicity, for most of them the same religion, same historical background. For all of the refugees in the world, this meant immediate integration, but no. The Palestinian refugees wanted to continue the war. Now, the West, which funded Unruh, especially the US and the UK, wanted to close Unruh down. But the Arab world threatened the West, and the West at the time, fearful that oil was important, they feared the Soviet bloc would take over the Arab world, caved in. And Unruh recently very proudly mentioned that it's celebrating 70 years. Now, it's amazing because it's 70 years of a temporary agency which should have closed after 3 or 4 years, having successfully settled the refugees. They should be ashamed of being alive for 70 years, not celebrate it. And in the book, what we detail is after the West caves in to the Arab world and begins to fund Unruh regularly as kind of a bribe, really. This is the point where it becomes a racket and a scam. From that point on, Unruh is transformed into a Palestinian organization that employs Palestinians and essentially underwrites the Palestinian idea that the War of 1948 is still an open file. And it is such a scam that as you go through the 5.5 million people that Unruh registers as refugees, you realize that almost none of them are refugees by any international standard. They're either citizens, such as in Jordan, or they're already settled in the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, or they've already left for new lives in Europe, but they're still registered as refugees from Palestine, keeping alive the idea that the War of 1948 is still not over.
I hope people are understanding how important this book is. I mean, we always encounter so much misinformation. It's crazy, ridiculous. And we find ourselves needing to be super patient and repeating ourselves. And it sounds like you have put something very important together. I want to read the tagline of your book, which says, "How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream has obstructed the path to peace." You're talking about much more than Unruh. Can you elaborate on that part of it?
Certainly. The book is really, in that sense, a kind of damning story about Western foreign policy repeatedly shooting itself at the foot. And what happens is Adi and I, coming from the Israeli peace camp, try to understand, why is there no peace? What has obstructed the path to peace? If it's not all the things, the occupation, the settlements, because as I talked about, all of these were not an issue. The Palestinians could have had their state without all of them. What has obstructed the path to peace? And we saw that it was this idea of the right of return. Now, we compared it to other refugees throughout the world in that area, and we saw that although many of them wanted to turn back the clock and return to their homes, they didn't get this, they didn't return, they didn't have a right of return, and no one indulged them in this idea that they have it. And we try to understand, why is it that the Palestinians have been indulged by the West, whereas Ukrainians and Poles and Germans and Koreans and Hindus and Muslims were not. And I talked about how the West caved in, but this became an ongoing 70-year process by which the West regularly not only just paid Unruh, but became increasingly blind to what Unruh became, and kept on indulging this notion that Palestinians are still refugees. Whereas all other refugees got the, call it, tough love message, which said, it's over, the war is over. Germans, you're not going back to Czechoslovakia, and you're not going back to Poland. The same for Ukrainians. Muslims and Hindus, this is India, this is Pakistan, it's over. South Koreans, that's it. You're staying there, you're not going, North Korea is no longer yours. All refugees throughout the 20th century, which was a century with many refugees, got this message of, it's over, tough, it's tragic, but move on. Palestinians are the only group to be indulged by the West. And by now, it's not just the US and the UK that fund Unruh, it's European countries, it's the EU, it's Australia, it's Japan. All of them every year sending over $1 billion to sustain the Palestinians in their worldview that the war of 1948 is not over, and that they can still undo it by means of return. And when we were trying to explain this Western indulgence, which is no longer just about the realpolitik decisions of the 50s, we realized that an entire mountain of lies was built over those 70 years, so that people today actually think that the Palestinians are refugees when they're not. They're citizens of Jordan. Many of them are middle class and even upper middle class. They have new lives in new countries. And whereas other refugees, when they become citizens, are no longer refugees, the Palestinians are the only ones that are indulged in this charade that they're still refugees despite being citizens of Jordan or of other countries. They sit in Ramallah. You have people who were born in Ramallah, lived in Ramallah all their lives, and yet they are considered by Unruh refugees from Palestine. If they were born in Ramallah and lived there all their lives, which Palestine exactly are they refugees from? They know the answer: from the river to the sea, the Palestine that will replace Israel. But why does the West fund that? Why does the West indulge that? And one of the answers, by no means the only one, but one of the answers we have is this neo-colonial attitude that I've invented a word for. I call it West-plaining. We all know what mansplaining is, but West-plaining is that it's the same thing. It's basically when someone tells someone else what they actually think. So West-plaining is when the West explains away what Palestinians have just said. Palestinians, by the way, to their credit, speak clearly. The right of return is holy. It's sacred. It belongs to every Palestinian. We will not give it up. It cannot be negotiated away. Every anti-Israel demonstration says Palestine from the river to the sea. And yet, what do you hear from Western diplomats? And Adi and I met with many. They don't really mean it. They know it's not going to happen. And I often have to tell those diplomats, I'm like, they're not children. They are rational human beings who know what they're fighting for. They're not passive people. They're agents of history. I often say that one of the things I really love about our book is that it gives the Palestinians the respect of listening to them, of taking them at their word, of taking their wishes and dreams seriously. And I always tell the European diplomats, look, Palestinians open a map, you're welcome to do so as well. They look and they see 7 million Jews struggling to maintain a sovereign state among 500 million Arabs, 1.5 billion Muslims, and they conclude that the Zionist experiment will not last. So they're not being irrational in their perspective. As far as they're concerned, they're going to wait another generation, another 5 generations. But why should they compromise with an entity that in their mind is going to disappear fairly soon? And this is the mindset that the West continuously indulges by funding it with $1 billion every year.
So you heard it here, everybody. West-splaining. That's very good. Can you also address, or does the book address, the Arab world and how the Arab world has played a role in encouraging this from the river to the sea?
So the Arab world is a fascinating tale here from the beginning to the present. First of all, if this has truly been an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it would have been over in April 1948. In April 1948, effectively, the war is won and the state of Israel can come into being. If it were not for 5 Arab armies that mobilized to invade and to help the Palestinians, at the time still called Arabs, the war would not have continued. Had the Arabs not sustained the Palestinian refugees in their view that the war will continue. I mean, this is the reason that in 1949, Israel only has ceasefire lines with all of its neighbors. The reason that it doesn't have borders, which is why no one should ever say pre-1967 borders, the reason that Israel doesn't have borders is because the Arab countries are very clear that as far as they're concerned, the war is there's a temporary ceasefire and the war of 1948 is not over. So they sustained the Palestinians by physically invading Israel, and then the repeat happens in 67 and it doesn't go so well for them again. And in 73, the Arab countries pretty much check out in terms of invading armies. But they continue to sustain the Palestinian cause financially with an Arab boycott and even an oil boycott. So they sustain this cause for decades, and they're the reason that Unruh exists, because they basically tell the West, you have to keep paying or we will be very angry. Now, what's interesting is the changes that are happening now. Because at the moment, for the last decade, as a result of the so-called Arab Spring, Iran changes, Israel emerging as a stable and reliable partner, you have Arab countries, especially Saudi and the Gulf, that are moving away from decades of anti-Zionism, of identifying the Arab cause with being a rabid anti-Zionist. And amazingly, what you hear today in the Arab world on Palestinians is something that no Westerner would dare say. They're calling it as it is because they know the scam that they've been running for 7 decades. So they're saying it as it is. They're basically telling Palestinians, you've made a mess of things. You've lost numerous opportunities. We don't want to sustain you anymore. We don't want to pour money into your cause anymore. And the thing that President Trump realized when he moved American funding from Unruh a couple years ago is he seems to have had an instinct for that historical moment when the repercussions for America pulling out from Unruh will be zero. I mean, in the 50s, President Eisenhower feared closing Unruh because of the repercussions with the Arab world and the importance of oil and what it would mean for the Cold War. None of this is relevant now. The Cold War is over. Soviet Union is gone. Oil is not what it used to be. The Arab world is not united in the same way that it was in the 50s. And you have Arab countries today that are openly saying that they want a different relationship with Israel. So we think the time is ripe geopolitically for discussing this scam with the West and telling them, look, it's over and you can defund Unruh. You can basically stop indulging this idea, and thereby you can actually finally open the path to peace after 70 years of pretty much guaranteeing that it could never happen.
Very, very interesting and important. There is a question that comes up from many, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. I know you're an amazing Zionist, and you've talked about Zionism to all of our students. I should also mention that you've addressed our Israeli college students in our diplomacy program in Israel, which is such an important program, the Israeli Fellowship. Thank you for that too. But what's wrong with the right of return? Are we being racist?
So first, there is no right of return. The notion that a people possess collectively a right that breaches the sovereignty of another state does not exist in the international system. Our international system, including our international law, is based on the idea of the sanctity of sovereign states. That's the basis for the UN. So you do not have a right that is enshrined in international law whereby a people collectively have a right, and this is how Palestinians imagine it, that breaches Israeli sovereignty, because in their mind, their right overrides Israeli sovereignty to settle in Israel. Now, no other people have that right. People who were brutally displaced. We tell in the book the story of the German refugees after World War II who were really brutally expelled after the war was over from Czechoslovakia, from Poland. Yeah, they wanted to return, but it was made very clear to them that they do not possess any such right. And the same was true for the Koreans and millions in Africa and across Europe, and of course the Hindus and Muslims. There is no such thing. So Israel is not being racist by saying that there's no such right. It's actually operating within the global norm. This is one of the things that we show throughout the book. Israel operates all the time within the global norms. In fact, Israel is repeatedly pushed to go above and beyond the global norms. Even the notion, Resolution 194, that Palestinians sometimes cite as giving them a right of return, and we urge people to read it, it gives them no such right. But even that was going very far in terms of the norms, of the global norms at the time. So again and again, we show that the Palestinians and the Arabs are being indulged in contravention of the global norms. So Israel is merely asking that the global norms be applied, that people do not return, that they move on, that they get the tough message that says tragic, but it's over, move on and build your life. This is the situation. No country has been forced to accept a people against its wish. I mean, it's not something that happens. Many countries accepted refugees, typically that were of the same ethnicity and of the same background. You have those situations. But people who were at war, who belong to minorities, absolutely not. The global norm has always been move on, build your lives. This was the case for the Jews who were brutally expelled from Arab countries. They moved on with their lives. That's the message that they got. It's the message for all other refugees in the world except the Palestinians.
I have a very basic question for you, because I know some of our audience members may be confused about this slogan, which is really the slogan of the right of return and disillusionment of Israel. What is this phrase, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free?
So the mandate area that the British controlled after carving out the carcass of the Ottoman Empire, they divided into quite a few states, which no one disputes their legitimacy today, states like Lebanon and Syria and Iraq and Jordan, and a small strip of land between the Jordan River, that's the river, and the Mediterranean Sea, that's the sea, that was allocated for a sovereign state for the Jewish people. I always like to mention that if the Jews had their fair share of the land of the Ottoman Empire, of which they were a people, the state of Israel would have been 6 times the size it is today. So the Arabs of the land rejected that idea from day one, opposed it violently, and when the state of Israel was established on the land, they continued their battle. This is return. What we show in the book is that the idea of the right of return was never innocent. To those who ask, why does Israel, it was never innocent. It was established immediately in the wake of the war as the continuation of war by other means. So the idea from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, sometimes I add in parentheses, of Jews. The idea is that in their view, from the river to the sea, there should only be one Arab state, and that there is no legitimacy whatsoever for a sovereign Jewish state in any borders. And that's the thing. It's important to note that the Arab-Palestinian struggle is against a sovereign Jewish state in any borders. And such was the struggle from day one. And this is where the idea of return comes in. It sounds innocent, it sounds innocuous, but when Palestinians during the years of negotiations for peace since Oslo said, we support 2 states, but when you ask them about the right of return, they say, oh, that's sacred. That belongs to millions of Palestinians. Then the only 2 states they ever envisioned as living in peace side by side was a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza and another Palestinian state to replace Israel. There has never been a moment in the Palestinian struggle where they envisioned, not just their leadership, even an op-ed writer, envisioned a peace agreement whereby at the end of the process, the state of Israel is allowed to stand as is.
Do you know why everybody loves you? Why?
Sure.
Because you are so clear. Because you are so clear. Okay, so speaking of clarity, take a shot at this. What do you think that the Israeli center wants?
So the Israeli center, which by the way now is much of Israel, I mean, the left, which believed in land for peace, and which thinks that the only reason that we don't have peace is because Israel hasn't done enough and should do more, that left has collapsed as a result of all the process that I described. It barely has 3 seats in the Israeli Knesset now. The Israeli right, the greater Israel, the one that thought that we should control all of Judea and Samaria, every square inch of it, that has collapsed too. They barely have a few seats in parliament and they're in opposition. Both are in opposition. Today, the Israeli center is massive, 70, 80%, if not more. And it's a bizarre center. Mika Goodman described it well. It's basically a center that said, look, we do not want to control the Palestinians. We don't. To anyone who thinks we do, we really, really don't. But we also don't know how to not control them in a way that ensures our safety and security. We tried via peace agreements, land for peace, as I said, rejected twice in 2000, 2018, and followed by a wave of violence. We tried unilateral disengagement, as in Gaza. That became a launch pad. By the way, because Gaza, 80% of the people who live in Gaza are registered as refugees. So they live in Gaza into the 5th generation now, but in their mind, Gaza is merely a temporary way station until they take back Palestine from the river to the sea. So of course they're going to use it as a launch pad to launch rockets. They don't want to make it into Singapore of the Middle East because as far as they're concerned, it's not their home. So this is in Gaza. This is the West Bank, and this is and most Israelis are saying, okay, so we can't stop controlling Palestinians by means of an agreement. We can't stop doing though by unilateral disengagement. What can we do? And people like Goodman have promoted the idea of lessening the occupation. And this is basically what Israel has done in the last decade. And Netanyahu, by the way, reflects the center fairly well. This idea of neither here nor there. And that's where we are. That's where the Israeli center. So the Israeli center wants not to control Palestinians, but to do it in a way that is truly safe and secure and guarantees peace.
Thank you. So we have questions coming in. We have a lot of questions coming in, but we'll try to do the best we can here. I have a question from a student in England, Barbara. How can a student like me show my campus that I can be proud of my Zionism and my feminist identity?
So I don't want to take the time as much here. So first of all, be proud of your feminist and Zionist identity. They work very well together. They're both identities of a previously oppressed, dispossessed, marginalized, call it what you want, people group who finally claimed their equality and are still fighting for their equality. I wrote a major essay called Anti-Zionism and Anti-Feminism. It's in tablet and you're welcome to look it up. And I also recently did a webinar with Zionists on this issue and it's also on the web so you can look it up. But I would encourage you to be a proud Zionist and feminist and not allow anyone who tells you that to be a feminist, you need to check your Zionism at the door to tell you that if anything, it's exactly the opposite.
Right, do not accept it, right? Elon from Israel asks, people come up with all kinds of reasons for lack of peace. Why do you think so often the right of return is left out of the conversation?
So until the 80s, until the beginning of the peace negotiations, things were very clear. As long as the Soviet Union and the Arab world were a major backer of the Palestinians, they did not hide their intentions. They were very clear on what they wanted. What happened at the end of the 80s with the fall of the Soviet Union is the Palestinians seek American support and they begin to speak American. They do not change their goal, but they change the language. They increasingly speak of rights. They increasingly speak of justice. Now, to a Westerner, to an American who hears justice, rights for Palestinian rights, for justice in Palestine, how can you be against it? It sounds like rights for the downtrodden or justice for the downtrodden. Until you understand that for Palestinians, rights means the right of return. Justice means correcting the injustice, which is the establishment of Israel. It's an annihilationist justice. There's no other justice as far as they're concerned. So they begin to speak of justice and rights, which the West, we go back to this neo-colonial West-planing attitude, takes as a major break. And remember, we're in this decade of end of history, all people are becoming free, all conflicts are coming to an end. So the West at this moment really believes that the conflict is now just about borders, occupations, settlements, and this is where all the focus moves. The Palestinians, as we show in the book, not for a single moment stop the idea of the right of return. I mean, they do not, I mean, they continue with it, but they just couch it now in the language of rights, and they de-emphasize it when they speak to Western audiences, because they know that if the message was, look, we still want all of it and we want Israel gone, they were not going to get American and European support. So the Palestinians have every interest in de-emphasizing the right of return when they speak to Western audiences. They do not say that, I mean, we have yet to find an op-ed or a Palestinian who will finally say, look, it's time to end this charade. There's going to be no return. We get it. And we're ready to make peace with Israel as the sovereign state of the Jewish people. That has not happened. And when it will happen, we will have peace. But they sometimes de-emphasize it, saying things like two states. And Westerners immediately interpret it in their own mindset when the Palestinians actually have never said it fully.
We've certainly heard from Omar Barghouti, who is one of the co-founders of the BDS movement, talk about the right of return and how there'll be no Israel, there'll be Palestine next to a Palestine. I mean, they're saying it, they're very clear about it. We just need to listen and stop West-splaining. Our final question that we can take for lack of time, I have more, but for lack of time. You've spoken, this is from Noah from New York. You've spoken to audiences around the world. What is the biggest misconception that you've found about Israel or Zionism, or both?
Wow, there are quite a few. One of my favorite is the one that has to do with religion, which is why I always like to emphasize in my talks that I'm a devoutly atheist Jew. It always messes with our minds and helps me explain why Zionism is the movement of a people with a historical connection to a land rather than some religious duty, but really a modern movement of a people taking charge of their fate, which is also why it's very much like feminism. And of course, what we have to deal with is just the toxic poison that so many have been exposed to in recent decades of evil, powerful Israel that is all out just to do evil. And sometimes I really have to take the audiences back to basics. Maybe I'll end with this. One of my favorite numbers to say is that I tell them, look, when the state of Israel was established, the ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region was 1 to 50, 50. So what did the Jews do? They asked a lot of Jews to come and immigrate. Many did, great success, over 3 million. And they make a whole lot of babies. We're one of the most fertile modern countries in the world. So we are now 10 times our numbers. The ratio of Jews to Arabs in the region today is 1 to 60. So I always like to say that there's no amount of procreation or immigration that will ever get the Jews out of their minority status. We are a minority. We were a minority in Europe. We were a minority in the lands of Islam. And despite being a majority in our own state, we are keenly aware of being a minority in the region. And all our actions, including our repeated willingness to compromise, including on important symbols like Zion and Judea, are not because they don't mean much to us, but because we understand that at the end of the day, we need to live in peace in an Arab and Islamic region. And we understand that if the path to peace will require compromise, we will do it. We have been repeatedly willing to do it. But we want to know that if we compromise on land, on other issues, peace will be real. and that it will be over, and that the Arab world will finally look at us, not as foreigners in their midst who will one day be thrown out like other foreigners, but a people who have truly come home.
Thank you very, very much. Just before you leave, I want to say one of the biggest misconceptions that I find is the map, how small Israel is, and you know, people just don't realize. So I encourage everybody listening who hasn't looked at a map lately to take a look at Israel in the Middle East. It's kind of shocking. It really is. And it reflects all those numbers you just gave us. So thank you so much for being with us. It was a wonderful session, and we look forward to having you back. And we look forward to, we had to cancel our VIP mission to Israel this May for obvious reasons, but hopefully, God willing, next May we'll be back, and hopefully you'll be able to be one of our speakers to grown-ups, not just students that you have spoken to over the years for Stand With Us. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to tell thank you. I want to tell our audience what's coming up next. We have on Monday, and check the time for your area. The Pacific time is 11 o'clock, but please do check this at Stand With Us Connect. Joshua Washington, the director of the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel, IBSI, IBSI. He's going to be talking about Zionism and Black civil rights, which is so important and topical right now. So please do join us on Monday of this coming week. That is June the 8th. I want to thank you all for joining us. If you like our work, if you appreciate what we do, please don't forget to support us. StandWithUs.com/donate. And once again, I want to remind you, go to Stand With Us Connect. You could see what we've done in the past. You could actually watch past shows right there, and you could see other shows that are coming up in the very near future. Really exciting, dynamic topics, supporting Israel and fighting anti-Semitism around the world. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.